Andrea. So yeah, welcome everybody. I suggested that Andrea could start with the presentation. Feel free to ask all your questions in the little box chat, and I will try my best to organize them as well as possible and to ask them effectively to Adrian. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Very good. Let me share my screen with you guys. So hold on for a little second and see if I can make that work. Yes, at least I have something on my screen. Andre, you see the same? You see something like a green starting sheet?
I see a lot of green, yes.
Lovely, very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be back here at Net Impact. I was browsing through my files, and it's a bit over a year that I was here for the first time with you, sharing, well, basically introduction into carbon markets. And ever since, carbon markets have been booming. That made Andrea and Andre decide, let's have a little update of what's going on. I love carbon markets, and that's not because it's my job, but it is because I think they are utterly useful, utterly effective, and can help us getting a bit closer to reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. Well, to mitigate climate change, to reduce emissions, and try to get, well, somewhere closer to 2 degrees global heating rather than, well, the catastrophic predictions that you hear nowadays. I love carbon markets, not so much because they are so handy tools for companies here in the Netherlands, in Europe, in the Western world, to offset any remaining emissions. Well, of course, that is very handy, of course. But I love them mostly because they can bring a lot of money and very quickly to reducing emissions in developing countries, in protecting forests, in restoring landscapes, in providing the poorest with energy, with sustainable energy. And that is where I think carbon markets are doing an excellent job. And it's needed, actually. So in February, the UNFCCC presented this depressing report in which they counted up all of the current pledges of countries to reduce their emissions. And they calculated how many emissions would be reduced and to what extent that would be helpful to reach the Paris Agreement goal of keeping global heating below 1.5 degrees. So this is a frightening slide. So all of the good intentions together add up to 0.5% of the emission reductions that are needed. All the emission reductions add up to 0.5% of emission reductions. Whereas to reach or to be able to keep global heating below 1.5 degrees centigrade, actually by 2030, emissions globally on this planet should be reduced by 45%. So this is frightening. But the point is, so this is what governments pledge and what governments report to the United Nations. So that's bad news. The good news, on the other hand, is, and that's why I love carbon markets so much, is that companies are currently taking responsibility and don't wait anymore for being regulated by the governments by which they are regulated and start acting themselves. And that is where carbon markets play an important role. Like I said, I love carbon markets a lot because because of when companies engage in purchasing carbon credits, that money and those huge amounts of funding are in the end direct investments to emission reductions and removals in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. And other than through government policies, voluntary carbon markets can do this quickly, could do this massively, and can actually, well, give us a bit of hope that we'll get somewhere closer to keeping global heating within manageable limits. In doing so, in realizing the investments, carbon markets can actually help developing countries in realizing and finding funding for implementing their climate policies. And they can help developing countries in actually taking on more obligations, taking on more ambitions, because once funded, then it becomes easier to do so. Carbon markets can enhance the direct involvement of companies and organizations. It's very visible. I mean, you all have probably seen in ads, on the news, in communications by corporations, what they are doing and how they are doing it. And participation in carbon markets, participation in carbon projects is a very visible thing, how people, how organizations can get involved. And let us not underestimate the boost of cooperation between companies and project developers and host country governments and all those actors arranging emission reduction projects and helping them get off the ground. Last year, let me first, before I go into the technical detail, let me first give you a bit of a glance how carbon markets are booming. And here in this graph, you'll see a bit of that. What you see here is how carbon credits have been used as offsetting mechanisms. So basically what you see here is a number of carbon credits used by companies to offset their own emissions and how that has been growing over the past couple of years. And well, this is actually super impressive. You see that whereas in 2016, only 33 million tons of CO2 were used to offset emissions, this has been growing and basically exploding as from 2020. So last year, in spite of the pandemic, the cancellation, the retirement of carbon credits by companies in Europe and the States increased from 68 to 92 million tons of CO2. And the expectation is that in this year, second year of the pandemic, this increases to 143%. So basically you see here that the use of carbon credits is basically following a COVID exponential curve in how fast carbon credits are growing and are used as an instrument to contribute to corporate emission targets. Impressive, absolutely impressive, this one. The underlying mechanism, why is this growing? Why is the use of carbon credits growing so much? Is, like I said, because many companies take responsibilities, realize that they are part of the climate problem and commit to net zero targets. Net zero targets means that they set a date, most often by 2050, by which they claim to not emit anymore. Or if they still emit, that they would compensate those emissions by taking an equivalent amount of emissions out of the atmosphere again and store that somewhere, either in a tree or into an underground reservoir or what have you. Many companies, in addition to pledging or committing to net zero targets, realize that well, while they are doing so, they still have emissions. For any industry, emissions do not change to zero overnight. And to contribute to, well, A, to show the world that they're serious, and B, to take responsibilities for the emissions that they're still emitting, many companies are currently committing to compensating their residual emissions until they are net zero. And they do so by purchasing carbon credits in the market and retiring these, canceling these. So basically to compensate what they're still emitting. And that is what is currently driving the market of voluntary carbon credits like mad. It started 2 years ago with a small number of large corporates doing so. And at this moment, it is a lot of companies doing so, leading to an explosion in demand and hence an explosion in transactions in voluntary carbon markets. Last year, I explained a bit what voluntary carbon markets are. And as I'm not sure everyone that is in the meeting today participated last year and has this still very clear, I'll go now into explaining just in a couple of slides what voluntary carbon markets actually are and how they work. Markets, voluntary carbon markets, like any market, consists of supply, demand, and a transaction in between. Demand, I've just explained. Demand is corporations here in Europe, in the United States, that see that they still have residual emissions that for one reason or another, responsibility, communication towards their clients, want to compensate the residual emissions, and they look for products, they look for emission reductions elsewhere that they can sponsor. On the other hand, there's supply. There is mostly in developing countries, in Africa, in Asia, in South America, project developers and countries that want to, well, reduce emissions, for instance, by establishing renewable energy or by protecting their forests, avoiding that they are burned down, providing or sanitizing landfills or what have you, and don't actually have the funding or don't have the possibility in regular markets to finance those projects. If they calculate, or when they calculate the emissions that are reduced by their activities, by protecting a forest, by building a wind farm, have that certified, then they have a product, a carbon credit, which, well, here the demand side is willing to buy and willing to sponsor. And then they engage in the transaction whereby the buyers buy the credits, use them to offset their emissions, and the sellers sell their credits, get the money, and make sure the projects run well and flourish. That is the basis of carbon markets. Like I told you, looking at the supply, looking at what is the money used for, it's used for a great number of different activities. It can be large-scale renewable energy. It can be smaller scale renewable energy. Community projects like what you're seeing here is a biogas tank, and the lady who is preparing her dinner is doing that on an efficient cook stove rather than on an open fire. Then there is projects in the field of forest protection, avoiding that forest gets cut or burns down. And there is replanting of trees, restoring landscape, restoring forest, improving forest management. The boost in demand is very visible in this graph. And mind you, this graph we prepared, or my colleagues prepared earlier this year, and it is already outdated now. The blue bars are the supply of carbon credits in the market. The green bars are the demand. And well, at some point early this year, we had expected that in a couple of years, demand and supply would be the same. And then afterwards, demand would be bigger than supply. At this moment, and those of you that are involved in carbon markets can already confirm that supply is very quickly running out, and that actually the growth of demand for carbon credits is going even faster than we predicted earlier this year. What we see, what I want to convey to you is that how it looks now, there is a lot of intention with large companies to compensate their residual emissions, so much that at this moment, it's very much looking for where can they spend the money to reduce emissions elsewhere. This is also very clear from, so the growth of the market also becomes very clear from what you read in the papers. This is just a, well, quick collection of headlines in international papers, either announcing that companies are indeed starting to compensate, but you'll also see critical notes like here the quote from Greenpeace that the claims that come with purchasing carbon credits are not solving the climate problem. And so it is a very mixed picture here. On the one hand, applauding that Europe leads the world aviation towards net zero carbon emissions, bravo. But at the same time, critical notes, what are they actually doing and does this work? And here I come, I think, to the main challenges and the main subject of our discussion today, which is if we want this system of compensation and investment in emission reductions elsewhere to work, what do we need to make this work and to continue making it work? And I have identified, at least in my opinion, the three major things that are needed. First, it is to ensure credibility. Second, it is to make sure that supply and demand meet and that transactions run smoothly. And last, but definitely is actually first, is that supply of carbon credits should be boosted and boosted massively. Ensure credibility. What is most needed there is that the ridiculous claims from large companies, well, and smaller companies, that by purchasing carbon credits, all of a sudden they are climate neutral and are not bad for the world anymore, which is what most of the marketing and most of the advertising suggest, that should be tuned down. In the end, this is marketing. People, companies do it to communicate to their stakeholders, to their clients, that they care about climate change. And an inflated claim can undermine the credibility of this entire mechanism. That we should keep that very much in mind. Smoothen transactions. So far, over the past years, over the past decade, it was a tiny market, and most transactions were just done over the counter directly from a buyer to a seller, perhaps with the intermediation of a broker. If the market is scaling up, we need more. You need trading platforms, you need standardized contracts, you need risk hedging, you need everything that a commodity market otherwise would need. And boosting supply, if there is a fixed and firm demand, then developing countries where the projects are taking place should get their act together and make sure that indeed forests are protected, that indeed renewable energy facilities are being set up and that they benefit from carbon finance coming in. There's a number of initiatives trying to support these three major challenges, and I've listed them in 2 slides for you, and then I hand over to Andre. The most known is the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which is an initiative launched in September last year by Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England, and climate envoy. It is a organization initiative mostly driven from London, very much aiming to, well, first of all, ensure the integrity of carbon credits, but I think their main contribution is in organizing the market, in organizing reference contracts, in organizing trade platforms, and organizing, basically bringing supply and demand together. Then more recently, there is the VCM Integrity Initiative, VCMI, that very much focuses on the claims, on credibility, and on how companies can communicate that they're actually using carbon credits as part of their climate commitment. Last but not least, there is the VCM Global Dialogue, which is an initiative where climate focus is very much involved in, which aims to bring to the table what needs to be done on the supply side. So how can countries, how can governments in developing countries get their acts together, embrace the voluntary carbon market, and make sure that they get most out of it? The VCM Global Dialogue is to, by the way, launch their initial findings next Tuesday. So if you go to the website vcm-gd.org, you'll be able to sign up still and participate in the event we will have on Tuesday. And by the end of October, the main conclusions and main recommendations on how to boost supply will be presented and hopefully embraced by participants in the carbon market. So far, my small introduction. Andre, what would you like to know more?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, there is a conceptual question that I think was the topic of the presentation last time, which is more on the concepts of how do those projects receive the funding? And I thought it was interesting to answer that question because eventually not everyone has attended the first presentation. So the idea being that you have the projects, you need the money to do the project. Do you receive the money before that the project is created or afterwards? And if afterwards, in between, what funding does the organization has to bridge that gap?
Yeah, good question. And a complicated question. In the end, of course, so you're asking how does the money from a payment finally reach the project? And here you should realize that a carbon market is not much different from other commodity markets, from a wheat market or an oil market or a potato market or what have you. So supply is about project development and is about arranging finance. So if you, for instance, if you are setting up a, let me come up with a tangible example. If you come up with, for instance, a project that sells energy efficient cook stoves to consumers in Africa, you make your business plan in doing so, which has costs, which has revenues, and revenues probably are revenues from selling your stoves and revenues from selling your carbon credits. When you've done your business plan, you try to finance it and you go about. In the end, you are selling stoves, you get income. In the end, you have carbon credits, you sell and you get income. And the financing of that all is often independent from how your carbon transaction is running or how you're selling your cook stoves transactions are running. So when I am buying a carbon credit, I mean, that is revenue. So in the end, the payment, my payment, your payment goes to the seller, but how that is used for boosting the business model, I don't know. Well, of course I can dig into it, but whether it is, so whether the price that they're getting is the price they would be expecting, I don't know. Whether they have financed their business beforehand through a loan, through their own equity, or through whatever, I don't know. And that is, well, that is not, that is what it is. Nowadays, now that now that demand is so much bigger than supply, and many buyers are looking to get into projects at very early stages, you do see hybrid constructions whereby, for instance, a buyer directly engages with a project developer, agreeing to buy, for instance, any of the carbon credits they would produce in 2 or 3 years' time. And as part of that transaction, they commit to providing a prepayment. Basically, they commit to co-financing the initiative. So that is a form that's happening, or that is starting to happening again. But in principle, the market transaction itself, namely, here is a carbon credits and I pay for it, that is irrespective of, well, underlying finance for the project. Does it answer the question?
I think it does answer the question. The question came from Stan. I don't know if Stan, did that fully answer your question?
Yeah, maybe I can give a bit of background for this one, because I was thinking very practical. You say that you're going to plant 100 trees, for example, and eventually those 100 trees will get into those credits. But do you know upfront that one tree will, catch so many CO2s, and that is what the credit is about? Or will that be determined after you have planted those trees? And also, does it happen on a yearly basis? Or is it just, I plant one tree and for its entire lifespan, it equals to so many emissions? Or do you, look at that on a yearly basis, that one plant or one tree captures so much CO2? So that was a bit of the rationale behind it. So how do you estimate that?
Yeah, well, good question, Stan, and I could definitely provide some insight here. So tree planting is actually a very tangible example. I mean, we all know trees, and we know trees are growing, and we all know trees are growing quite slowly. The other thing is, it is, I mean, provided that we care about how we plant the tree and how we plant and how we manage it, foresters can pretty much predict how fast the tree will be growing and how big the tree will be in 20, 30, or 40 years. So beforehand, it is, if you make your calculations correctly, you can estimate quite accurately how much CO2 will be captured in the tree during its lifetime. And probably based on those estimates, you will look for a buyer of the carbon credits that believes your calculation and is willing to commit already now at the early stages to engage in your project. Once you have planted the tree starts growing, and probably, I mean, trees grow slowly, and probably in the first couple of years, they're still quite tiny, but at a certain point, they start being, start becoming voluminous, and there will be growth of the woody structure, and they're actually, the moment the tree goes bigger and the moment the tree grows bigger and heavier, basically you see by the amount of wood that the tree represents that CO2 is being converted into tree. In the logic of the carbon market, you would probably monitor the growth of your forest, the growth of your trees, on a yearly or on a 2-yearly basis. And you would probably calculate, or monitor and then calculate how much biomass has been added to your forest since the last time you measured. And that is the number of carbon credits that you will probably bring to the market. So while your forest is growing, you measure and calculate every year how much biomass has been added to your plot. You convert that to carbon credits, you have that certified. And you can bring that to the market. Well, there's more nuance to it, but that's the basic principle. And at a certain point, the trees stop growing, and then they have reached their mature size, and then from then on, well, you should take care that the trees are still there, but there will not be any further carbon credits. But then we speak of tens of years down the road. Does it answer your question, Stan?
Yeah, that's very informative. Thank you for that.
Maybe we can follow up on the question actually. So from Olga is wondering, what is your take on carbon reduction as opposed to sequestration? Because of course there is always the idea that we cannot be planting trees forever. So do you think that there should be more initiatives? Do you think initiatives should be maybe more efficient, more effective? What is your view on that?
Okay, very straightforward. We need both. Tree planting, so sequestration is needed. Tree planting is actually only, at the same time, tree planting is actually only useful when we stop chopping the trees that are still there. So when it comes to different types of carbon credits from protecting forests versus carbon credits from planting trees, at this moment we need both. We can't plant trees while the forests are on fire. So if we succeed in stopping deforestation in the next 10-15 years, then from then on it's very good to invest mostly in tree planting, while of course at the same time trying to reduce the emissions, decarbonize the supply chain of all of our major productions. So yeah, both, everything. At this moment, we are still in a stage of combating climate change that we need every instrument, every tool that is available to us. There is any discussion preferring one option over the other is at this moment completely ridiculous.
Clear. I think that's quite clear. Does it answer your question, Olga?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering about your opinion, because I'm actually working on the project that aims at decarbonizing supply chains. And all we hear is carbon credits, which makes us sometimes think, should we assume automatically that if the market is booming for carbon credits, the same thing is going to happen for the reduction units that we're trying to generate? Or because technically, we have a limitation, because for the reduction units, we're limiting the companies in the sense that they can only purchase the reduction units that are within their own supply chain. So that's a bit of a tricky one. And we're having long discussions about should 1 ton of CO2 reduced be more expensive or cheaper than 1 ton of CO2 sequestered. So we're having lots of those discussions. I was just wondering if you have any opinion on that. Like, is this more important? Is there any difference in value? Is something to you, is one of the directions is a priority to you? What would you say?
Yeah, thank you, Olga. I have strong opinions on this. First and foremost, the most important thing is that all companies reduce their own emissions, full stop. So every climate change contribution by a corporation is reducing emissions in its own supply chain. That is where it starts. Then if there are in the end any residual emissions, sure, then it would be good that companies take responsibility for the residual emissions. So when they have just depleted all of the possibilities to cut their own emissions, and then it would be good that everything they emit, they also commit to take it out of the air again and convert it into a tree or put it underground or whatever. While we are still not there, I'm very much in favor that companies run the extra mile and contribute to helping others reducing their emissions, which is another formulation for purchasing carbon credits. But in fact, while they are working on their own supply chain decarbonization, it is good that at the same time, they also help others. And then I'm fine that they say, okay, we compensate our emissions or whatever narrative they use. But it's a narrative. It's not a scientific thing. It is just their corporate responsibility that they do more in reducing emissions wherever on the planet while they still have emissions themselves. So in that sense, purchasing carbon credits is, in my view, by its nature, a temporary activity. It is the stuff that their companies are doing as long as they are not carbon neutral, climate neutral themselves yet. Well, having said that, I would definitely be in favor, even if companies were climate neutral, it would still be good if they spend money on helping others reducing emissions. But I think that is a long shot for many companies. But who knows? It makes a good story.
It does make sense, yeah. Thanks.
Nice, very clear. I think Jigme, you have a follow-up questions. Maybe you want to ask it yourself.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here as well, of course. And Adriaan, thank you for the presentation. I had a question that came up very much because I work at EY, I guess. So it's that kind of question. How do you verify and independently validate carbon credits that would be sold? And what is your opinion on the current, let's say, options out there for independently verifying carbon credits?
Lovely question, Jigme. There's two sides of it. One side that has been organized and the other side that has not been organized. So on the project side, it has been pretty well organized. So there is a number of standards, the gold standard and the VCS being the two most important ones that have detailed protocols and detailed certification methods with accreditation and everything that is needed to make sure that a carbon credit produced in a project is actually representing a ton of reduced emissions. But that part is, can be improved, definitely, but that part is pretty well organized. The part where you are working with EY, which is how does a carbon credit compensate an emission of, say, for instance, Shell, or say Unilever, or say whatever company, that part is not standardized. And that is where we are currently having, well, problems in, well, not knowing if Shell says, I buy or I offer you a carbon credit, and by that act, the gasoline or your trip by car fueled by Shell fuel is climate neutral. That has not been standardized, proven, or whatever. And that is also why you see now that, for instance, the Dutch Advertising Board, the Reclamecodecommissie, is ruling on all claims that companies make based on their purchasing and retiring carbon credits. So whereas, for instance, in finance, it's very clear how an annual account of a company should be audited and should be certified, there is nothing like how the CO2 balance sheet of a company and how carbon credits play a role in compensating it, how that is to be audited and certified. So your question on the supply side has been arranged. On the side of how do you compensate emissions with carbon credits, it's Wild West.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. A good answer.
Very nice. I think I saw a follow-up on that question. There is a question from Novelia on credit credibility. Novelia, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, so I'm actually a student. I just starting to study about the credit. I'm studying in master in Vietnam. I'm just wondering, and I believe this seminar will be very insightful for me to study about carbon. Then I just really wonder about the credibility, because I'm thinking like, is there any standard for the credibility? So it's gonna be like influence the engagement of the company to the system or mechanism, especially in developing country.
I don't really think I understand your question, Ovelia. Could you repeat it again,
Yes, so
please?
I would like to know about the credibility. What is exactly the credibility of the credit? Is there any indicators, the exact indicators of the credibility, or it's just a terms to define like the high quality credit, or I don't know. But
Okay.
I mean, how do we believe, or how do the credit prove that this is a credibility enough?
Yeah, got it. So, like I said in my answer to Jigme, on the project side, this has been pretty well arranged. So in calculating and measuring and certifying an emission reduction from a forest protection project, or from a renewable energy project, or from a waste reduction project, or from a transport project, for all of these different project types, there are extensive protocols that by which project developers can calculate and measure and have it certified their emission reductions. So on that point, it is basically the trust in the thoroughness of the protocol and the reliability of the companies applying it and certifying it that determines the credibility of the carbon credits. And like I said before, there is always room for improvement, because in the end, these are protocols that people have prepared, and it's not wrong, it's not science. It's an agreement that you do it like that. Of course, built on science, but always based on assumptions as well. So that is, so the quality of the credits, I am less concerned about. The quality, to which extent those credits relate to an emission of, for instance, when you drive your car, that is where the discussion is. And that is where currently there is very little harmonization, and hence a risk for losing credibility. And I'm quite afraid, and here I feel with you, that when the likes of our big oil companies make too bold claims on climate neutrality based on purchasing carbon credits, I would think that credibility will be put at stake and potentially undermine this entire mechanism. So the largest challenge when it comes to accounting, in my view, is this moment how companies that purchase carbon credits account for those in their own carbon accounting, and that is where a lot of credibility can still be gained.
Does that answer your question, Novelia?
Yes, it is. It is. I think I need more study about it, and I'm just thinking about if there is an international standard, then it should be applicable to all the countries in the world. Yes.
Yeah. What is also, and here we get a bit technical, what is complicating is that the carbon accounting by companies is completely different from the carbon accounting on the global level. So all of the emissions that are registered and reported under the UNFCCC, basically the registers and emission reporting under the Paris Agreement, they're completely separate from what individual companies purchasing carbon credits are doing. I mean, of course, on the larger level, in the end, there may be some consolidation. But for instance, a milk factory in the Netherlands is not reporting CO2 emissions to the Dutch authorities, and their individual emissions are not included directly in the Dutch reporting. So there is confusion all over when it comes to carbon accounting and to which extent individual emissions of companies and their using carbon credits, how it relates to well, reaching the entire global goal of reducing emissions. And that is where, well, at least more clarity might be useful.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. I think Andrea had a quite closely related question with the concept of additionality measurements. Maybe Andrea, you want to ask the question yourself to make it clear?
Yes,
Yeah, sure. Oh, was this to Andrea, or who was this to? Sorry.
I believe it was you who asked the questions related to additionality measurements in the market at this point.
I don't think I asked that one. I asked a different one. I think Trevor asked the one about.
My apologies, Trevor.
Okay.
Yeah, that was me. Sorry, just moving to a place I can talk here. But yeah, I just I guess kind of building off that point, was just curious a bit on, yeah, I guess what the state of these additionality measurements are, around, I have some experience in the energy markets, maybe a corollary in there, there's a bunch of kind of controversy about, how do we measure an impactful, energy contract, right? Should I be buying locally? Should I be buying in the dirtiest grid, for example, in energy context? I'm curious how that applies, say, to a clean cook stove project where, you can make an argument that the business might be good enough that it could, work without this external funding.
Yeah. Not sure if we are. I mean, additionality is one of the big words in carbon credits. So let's make sure that when using the word additionality, we're actually talking about the same. So when it comes to carbon credits, additionality is the concept that establishes that without the intervention of the carbon finance, the project would not have come off the ground. So in the setting up of every carbon credit, a project developer needs to demonstrate that the project would actually not come off the ground, be it for expected income from selling carbon credits. This is an endless discussion, and it's not and for any project type, it is not set in stone that what is additional today will still be additional tomorrow. So for instance, in the field of renewable energy, 10 years ago, in the additionality thinking, any large wind farm or hydropower plant was still thought to be additional when financed through carbon credits or with the help of carbon credits. Meanwhile, the cost of those technologies, those technology anyways, have developed tremendously, making it, well, economically feasible investments in most parts of the world. And that has led to the decision by both Gold Standard and by BCS to not allow, because of additionality, not allow renewable energy projects in most countries of the world anymore to generate carbon credits. Only in least developed countries where, well, investment costs are higher for obvious reasons of market access. Only there, additionality for large wind farms and hydropower plants, solar farms can still be considered. But in the rest of the world, so not anymore in Turkey, not anymore in India, not anymore in China or wherever. So that has developed. At the same time, there's also a number of project categories that are, say, have proven to be basically additional always, so basically unable to finance anyways without the assistance of carbon credits, that they have been placed on so-called positive lists. So, for instance, most of cookstove projects do need additional finance and then by default are considered additional. So for some projects, it has become more difficult or impossible to prove additionality. For other projects, it has become easier, given the fact that these are very difficult projects in the first place.
Does that answer your question, Trevor?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm just thinking, from the perspective of someone who, say, is looking to buy carbon credits, offsets, et cetera, for a company. Yeah, I mean, I've been in this position. It's just very hard to navigate this field, particularly when you're trying to be as additional as possible. I guess the only just quick follow-up, I'd be curious. I realize this is a very difficult question, but what would be the very short summary of, how you might guide someone in my position in this, theoretical sense of, what are some good signs to look for and not for, additional projects? I know there's obviously standards, gold standard, VCS, but, any other kind of hints to navigate that process?
Well, in principle, if a carbon credit has been issued under the gold standard or under the VCS, they have undergone additionality testing. So by the virtue of those standards, they are additional, full stop. Having said that, and here we come to the more tricky part of it, I mean, in the end, in the voluntary carbon market, companies buy carbon credits for communication purposes. So they need to make sure towards their clients and towards consumers that what they're doing is good for the world. And then it's not only the certification by VCS of gold standard that counts, but it's also the story that you can tell. And for instance, at this moment, you can still buy carbon credits, gold standard certified, from wind farms in Turkey that were produced 7-8 years ago. They are perfectly additional, perfectly certified, but I don't think anyone can explain to their customers that emissions are compensated by 8-year-old carbon credits from Turkey. Because people don't understand that concept anymore because for obvious reasons. So in selecting your carbon credits, on the first end, yes, you do need to consider the proper certifications, but then again, have a look at, can I explain this project category or this vintage, which the age of carbon credits, or can I explain this country to my customers? And that is where probably on a case-by-case basis, you decide whether or not to buy a certain class of carbon credits.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Let there be no misunderstanding. There are quite some energy companies on the budget end of the market that offer climate neutralized natural gas, and they use the cheapest carbon credits available, and their customers they take it. I don't think energy companies at the higher end of the market would do the same, but at the lower end of the market, consumers are probably less critical, and they buy into that story, even though the carbon credits would not be fit for communicating by Green Choice or by whoever.
Clear. Thank you. I think so. There is 4 minutes left. I would maybe go for a last question from Andrea, and then maybe Adrian, I think you have an announcement which could be interesting for the whole public. So let's maybe go for a short last question, Andrea.
Yeah, super, thanks. And Adrian, this is to your point about mentioning that carbon crediting or offsetting was a sort of temporary solution, because you hear a lot of call to action for governments to implement a meaningful and activating carbon tax. And I'm wondering from your perspective, if that were to happen, how would that affect the voluntary carbon markets? Would this basically steer funds away from carbon offsetting towards a tax, a hard tax? And how would that affect the communities and the people that actually very often benefit from these projects? Like, for example, the cook stove, for example, the gas digester, and so on and so forth. So what's the trade-off here? Is how would a carbon tax affect the people who actually are benefiting from this market?
Yeah. You mean a carbon tax in, for instance, Kenya, or you mean a carbon tax in the Netherlands?
For example, where the greatest emissions are occurring, if you want to steer the economic activity, one of the tools to do that is a heavy tax, but that of course then eliminates the funding.
Yeah.
For some of these projects.
This is a very complicated question. Congratulations. Can do a couple of things. So there is in developing countries, there are a number of developing countries that are currently implementing or having implemented already a carbon tax. South Africa is well known. Colombia is another one that's well known, where emissions, local emissions, are taxed for, well, a certain amount. In both of these countries, currently, the governments are linking their carbon tax with voluntary carbon markets. So companies that are subject to the Colombian carbon taxation can choose, instead of paying the tax, to purchase carbon credits from Colombian voluntary carbon projects. And hence the Colombians have basically created a domestic financing mechanism for all those project categories that they want to have implemented, but are not subject to the carbon tax. So for instance, in the waste sector, cook stoves is another good example. Forest protection is a good example. Those are categories of projects, of investments that create carbon credits that are, well, craving for finance. And in a country like Colombia, these are partly financed by revenue or by the system of their carbon taxation. That could be an option for quite a few countries. Carbon taxation in the Netherlands, for instance, if we would ever get it, sure, that would put a price on any remaining emissions of any company in the Netherlands. That would, well, individual companies can then still decide whether voluntarily they would still compensate it or only pay the tax to the government. I don't know. In the end, I think those two are pretty separated. And when it comes to voluntary offsetting, I'm not sure if, well, let's see whether that would dry up demand for carbon credits elsewhere. But could be. I don't have any data on that. So
okay.
Still, for instance, and then carbon taxation, I mean, to make a final remark, I know very few countries where carbon taxations cover the entire economy.
Yeah. Interesting to see that this is already happening in some markets. So, or that they're linking these two components together makes sense. Thanks. So
maybe Adrian, you would like to do an announcement, maybe?
Yeah, my announcement. So, ladies and gentlemen, here. So, Climate Focus is quickly growing at this moment, and we will be posting a number of job ads over the next couple of weeks. So those of you that are convinced by my story and think I want to work on this as well, please have a look, keep monitoring our website and our LinkedIn page, and we welcome any of your applications.
That sounds amazing. And also, in case the audience has more questions, can they contact you or maybe send the question to us, and then we can maybe gather them and then send them to you eventually? Please
send me any questions. If they become too many, then I'll kindly, then I'll be a little slower, but generally I'm happy to answer anything.
That sounds very exciting. Well, thank you very much. I think we are 2 minutes after 1. If no one has, do you still have time for additional questions, or let's finish it?
I would think probably it's been lovely like this.
Yes.
Top. Then thank you very much for everyone to come, and thank you so much, Adrian, for the insights. I think it's wonderful. I love the topic, and you have been astonishing me every minute. I loved it.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Yes. Hey, thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Andre.
Have a
Bye,
very nice
everyone.
day, guys.
Have a nice day. Have a nice
Thanks
weekend.
a lot. Have a nice weekend.